The strangest thing about that night was not the laughter echoing through the ballroom. It was the fact that not long after he turned me into a joke in front of that room, my father's phone began vibrating nonstop. My name is Natalie Brooks. 3 weeks ago, at my father's retirement gala in a grand old hotel in Greenwich, Connecticut, he stood on stage, beneath crystal chandeliers, in front of more than 250 distinguished guests, introducing each member of the family as though he were listing the greatest achievements of his life. He praised Linda, his second wife, as the perfect support system. He called Marcus Mercer, her son from her previous marriage, the bright future of the company. Then his eyes landed on me. He smiled, that kind of fake gentleness I had known since I was a child, and said, "And this is Natalie, my daughter." Proof that not every child turns out to be an investment. The whole room burst into laughter. Then he added, slow and precise in the cruelest way, "Some children are simply lessons in disappointment." I did not cry. I did not lower my head. I simply stood up, raised my glass, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "Enjoy your standing ovation, Dad. It's the last one you'll ever give while standing on something I built." The entire ballroom went silent. Not long after I walked out, his phone began vibrating nonstop. If you have ever lived through a moment when one sentence changed the direction of your life, stay with me until the end of this story. And if my story touches something in you, please subscribe and leave me a comment telling me where you are listening from, or whether you have ever had to walk away, just to hold on to your self-respect. Because what happened after that night was far more complicated than simple payback. It was the first time my father found out who I really was. Back then, my house was beautiful in the exact way that made outsiders assume, after just one look, that it had to be full of love inside. The front lawn was always trimmed flat and soft as velvet. The hydrangea bushes changed with the seasons. The dining table was always covered with a white tablecloth on Sunday nights. Family photos lined the hallway in frames so carefully arranged that sometimes I felt like everything in that house was tended to more lovingly than the feelings of the people living there. After my mother died, there was a short period when my father grew quiet. He moved through the house like a man who had lost something very important and had no idea where to look for it. I used to think that grief might keep us close to each other. But then Linda Mercer came in, carrying soft perfume, proper smiles, and her 13-year-old son, Marcus Mercer, with his neatly combed hair and the confidence of a child who had never once doubted that the world would save its best place for him. At first, everything was polite. Too polite. Linda never once raised her voice at me. She did not need to. She had another way, something far more subtle. She rearranged my mother's kitchen cabinets, changed the curtains in the living room, and moved old photographs away from the center of the house, all in a gentle voice, as though it were simply the sensible thing to do. "The house needs a fresh start," she told my father. And my father nodded. I stood in the doorway, watching my parents' wedding photo being taken off the mantel. And for the first time I understood that some things are not taken from you with noise. They disappear in silence. Marcus, meanwhile, slipped into the new life as though he had always belonged there. My father taught him golf at the club on weekends. The two of them watched baseball together, talked about business together, laughed at jokes no one ever bothered to explain to me. At dinner, my father asked Marcus about his grades, about his opinions, about what he wanted to do with his life someday. When it was my turn, if it was ever my turn, the question was usually just, "Was school okay today?" I still remember one time I brought home an essay with the highest grade in the class. I stood in the doorway of my father's study, the paper in my hand slightly wrinkled because I had been gripping it too tightly for too long. He was on the phone. I waited. When he hung up, I smiled and held the essay out to him. He glanced at it, nodded once, and said, "Good," before turning to Marcus, who was standing behind me with a math report card. My father's eyes lit up instantly. "Now this," he said, patting Marcus on the shoulder, "this is the kind of discipline that gets people somewhere." I stood there for a few more seconds, still holding my paper, then quietly backed out of the room without anyone telling me to. Linda was at her best when she made everything sound like kind advice. If I said I wanted to join a club at school, she would smile and say, "That's a nice idea, but you should also learn to be more realistic." If I picked a thick book to read at the dinner table, she would tilt her head and say, "Natalie always lives more in her head than in the real world." If guests came over and someone complimented me for being well-behaved, Linda would usually rest a hand on my shoulder and reply in a warm voice, "She's very quiet, so sweet. She hardly ever causes any trouble. Hardly ever causes any trouble." I heard that sentence often enough to understand it was not a compliment. It was how adults described a child who had learned that the smaller she made herself, the easier she was to accept. Only my grandmother Evelyn never looked at me that way. She called me every Sunday, whether it was raining or snowing, and asked what I was reading, which subject I liked best, whether there was anything lately that had made me feel excited. She listened to my answers as though my thoughts truly mattered. One time, when I spent the weekend at her house, she sat beside me on the back porch, held my hand for a long time, and said in a calm voice, as though she were telling me something simple she had known all along, "One day, they will need the very thing they once refused to give you. When that day comes, do not beg for love. Decide whether they still deserve to be part of your life." At the time, I just looked at her, not fully understanding. I was still too young to know that some adults go their whole lives without ever learning how to love fairly. But her hand was warm, her eyes were steady, and for the first time in a very long while, I felt that in this house, carrying the Brooks name, there was still at least one person who truly saw me. The road from Grandma Evelyn's back porch to a lecture hall in Boston was a long one, but during my first years of college, I truly believed I was heading in the right direction. I studied hard, not just because I wanted good grades, but because every assignment that came back with encouraging comments, every professor who remembered my name, every small plan I made for myself gave me the feeling that my life finally belonged to me instead of still being in someone else's hands. I had a packed class schedule, a part-time job at the library, and an application I was preparing for a summer program I had dreamed about for almost a year. For the first time in a long time, I was not just trying to get through the days. I had started imagining my future in a voice that was no longer cautious. Maybe that was why, when my father called and said, "We need to talk as a family," I already knew something bad was about to happen, but I still did not think it would be that bad. I took the train back to Connecticut in the middle of the week. The late afternoon sky was a dull gray, and when I stepped into the old house, I felt like I had returned to a place my body had once belonged to, but my spirit had long since left behind. No one welcomed me like a daughter coming home from far away. The housekeeper said my father was in his study. I walked down the hallway, past the family portraits, where my face was always in the right place, but never truly at the center. My father sat behind his desk, back straight, both hands resting on a stack of papers, like a man about to announce something completely reasonable. Linda stood beside him, one hand lightly resting on the back of his chair, in that perfectly measured kind of closeness that made it clear they were on the same side. Marcus was not there, but one look around the room was enough for me to understand that this conversation was about him from beginning to end. My father began in that familiar calm voice. "Marcus has just been accepted into the MBA program at Kellerton." He paused, as if waiting for me to show the appropriate level of admiration. "It's a major opportunity. The family needs to make a strategic decision." I said nothing. There are moments when silence arrives faster than any reaction. "The cost is too high to support both of you at the same time," he continued. "You'll need to put your education on hold for a while." For a while, that was how people made a cut sound more temporary than it really was. I looked at him, then at Linda. She tilted her head, her voice soft, like she was calming down a stubborn child. "Natalie, men need to build careers. Women need stability. You'll be fine." I do not remember how long I sat there without moving. I only remember that my heart was not pounding the way I thought it would. It turned cold. So cold that every sound in the room felt unfamiliar, even the sound of my own voice when I said very quietly, "You promised Mom you would make sure I got a full education." Something flickered across my father's face for a split second. Not guilt, just irritation that I had brought up something he did not want to hear. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on me. Your mother is gone. I'm the one making the decisions now. That sentence did not make me burst into tears. It made something inside me shut off completely. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just the part of me that had once believed that someday, if I worked hard enough, behaved well enough, and tried hard enough, I would finally be chosen, quietly died in that room. I said nothing more. By then, something in me had already gone past pleading. I just sat there a few more minutes, listening to my father talk about budgets, about the future, about responsibility to the family, as if I were not part of that family at all. Just a line item that could be crossed off the expense sheet for now. That night, I went downstairs to get some water and heard Linda's voice drifting out from the dining room. She did not know I was standing in the hallway. Richard did the practical thing, she said, her voice lowered, but perfectly clear. Marcus actually has the kind of future worth investing in. No one objected to that sentence. No one said Natalie deserved it too. No one mentioned that I was the biological daughter of the man sitting in that room. I stood there for a long time, my hand still resting on the doorframe. The yellow light spilled over the dining table, glasses clinked softly inside the room. And in that moment, I realized that some decisions do not just take away opportunities. They redefine your place in someone else's heart. That night, for the first time in my life, I knew one thing for certain. In the house that carried the Brooks name, I had never been the dream they wanted to hold on to. I was only the thing they were willing to let go of when they needed to save the better portion for someone else. Years later, I would learn that the truth was even uglier than that. It was not that the family did not have enough money. There was money that had been left specifically for me, and my father took it. The next morning, I did not tell anyone I was leaving. No one asked either. I pulled my suitcase down the front steps while it was still early, the air so cold that my fingertips went numb, and for one brief moment I stood still and looked at the door behind me. That house was still beautiful, still quiet, still carried that polished look that made outsiders easily assume it had once been a safe place. But I understood very clearly that some places, even if you grew up there, were never truly your home. I left Connecticut with a few $1,000s in savings, a few outfits, and a few books. I also carried a vague feeling of shame that, at the time, I was still too young to name correctly. Not shame because I had done something wrong. It was the kind of shame that grows when you are treated as if you are not worth keeping. Boston met me with long days, crowded train rides, and an apartment so small that every time I stretched out my arms, I felt like I could almost touch both walls. My first winter there was brutally cold. The wind slipped through the cracks in the old window like it knew exactly where the human body was easiest to hurt. There were nights when I slept in a heavy sweater and my coat, curled up under two thin blankets, listening to the old radiator rattle like a promise that was never fully kept. During the day, I did every kind of office work I could find to pay the rent, from data entry, answering phones, to organizing other people's files. At night, I studied. I studied through free courses, through old materials I managed to get my hands on, through blurry videos and articles I read over and over until I knew them by heart. I was no longer sitting in a lecture hall like my friends my age, but I refused to let that become the end of the story. The first job that pulled me close to the logistics industry was only a data support position at a small company near the port. It did not sound like much. I sat in front of a screen for hours, reviewing orders, matching numbers, checking routes, updating system errors. But the more I worked, the more I started to notice something strange. I could see bottlenecks other people overlooked. I could tell that a delay chain was not caused by a lack of people, but by one wrong step at the very beginning of the process. I understood that a broken delivery schedule was not just because a driver showed up late, but because someone had built the entire system on a bad assumption. I was not just doing the work. I could see how everything functioned underneath the surface. The first person to notice it was Walter Barnes, the owner of the company. He was the kind of man who, from the first time you met him, made it clear he did not waste compliments. A rough voice, a hard temperament, always looking like he had no patience for mediocrity. One evening, after I stayed late to fix a reconciliation sheet no one had asked me to touch, he stopped by my desk, set down his coffee cup and asked, "Who taught you to catch a mistake like this?" "I saw it myself," I said. He looked at me for a few seconds without smiling. "Good. Then starting tomorrow, don't just fix errors, tell me why they happened." That was how Walter gave people opportunities. No hand-holding, no coddling, just throwing harder work at you and seeing whether you had enough backbone to hold on to it. He corrected me bluntly, made me explain every decision, made me learn how to speak briefly, accurately, without blaming anyone, without feeling sorry for myself. One time I handed him a proposal after 12 straight hours of work. He finished reading it, set it down and said, "You're smarter than this draft. Don't hand me something written out of exhaustion." I hated him for about the first 2 weeks. After that, I was grateful for him for many years. I grew up on cheap dinners eaten in a hurry at a folding table, on nights when my eyes burned from studying too late, on the feeling that no one was backing me up, so I had no choice but to stand up straight on my own. Bit by bit, I was not just surviving anymore. I started getting good. Then, very good. By the time I was 28, I had founded Northline Strategy Group. I did not put my face on the website, did not appear in industry publications, did not build a personal brand. Not because I was afraid of attention, but because I understood the Brooks family far too well. If they found out I was rising, they would either find a way to call it their doing, or worse, find a way to step on it before it was strong enough to stand on its own. Then one day, when Northline had grown large enough to start landing on the radar of major clients, my assistant brought a file into my office that needed urgent review. I picked it up, opened to the first page, and instantly felt my hand go cold. Brooks Global Freight. My father's company. I stared at that name for a long time, so long that my assistant finally asked quietly, "Is there a problem?" I looked up, set the file down very gently, and said in the calmest voice I could manage, "No, just send it to Daniel before it goes to legal." She nodded and walked out. The moment the door closed, I finally let myself lean back in my chair. Some names do not need to be spoken out loud to pull an entire stretch of your life back into the room. But this time, what came back was not weakness. It was the kind of stillness that appears when a person has finally run out of illusions. Northline did end up taking Brooks Global Freight as a client. Not because I had gone soft, and not because I wanted to prove anything to my father. I took it because it was a major contract at exactly the right time, and my company was entering the kind of stage where one good decision could change its path for years to come. I had not built everything I had just to keep reacting to my family like a 20-year-old girl pushed away from the decision-making table. I signed that contract the way I had learned to do everything else in life. Clear-headed, precise, without letting the past run the present. Then month by month, Northline did not just fulfill our part of the deal. We went deeper into their system than any partner before us ever had. Daniel Reeves, my CFO, was the first person to say out loud what everyone on the team had already noticed. During a morning meeting, he flipped through the materials, tapped the report with the tip of his pen, and said, "If they keep relying on us at this level, we're no longer just a vendor. We're supporting some of the most critical parts of their operation." He was not exaggerating. My team redesigned their shipping routes, fixed bottlenecks at transfer warehouses, cut losses their side had treated as unavoidable costs for years. We preserved key client contracts that, if they had slipped even one more quarter, would have hit Brooks Global Freight hard. Everything on their side ran through Daniel, through my legal department, through the account managers. No one met with me directly. I made sure it stayed that way. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted work to remain work, at least on paper. But life always has a way of creating contradictions that, if I had heard them from someone else, I probably would have thought were too perfectly arranged. A few times, at industry conferences, I followed from a distance, through live streams or clipped videos. My father stood in front of a crowd, talking about their operational restructuring, and mentioned Northline in a voice full of admiration. He called us the new backbone of the company's resilience. Once, he even said, half joking, half serious, "Whoever is running that firm understands this business better than most people I've known in 30 years." I heard that sentence in my own office, my hand resting on the edge of my desk, and felt a chill run down my spine. Not because I felt satisfied, but because the man who had once decided I was not worth investing in was now using the capability I had built to strengthen the reputation of the second half of his career. Power does not always arrive in the moment someone kneels in front of you. Sometimes it arrives in the truth that they have been relying on you for a long time without ever realizing it. During that time, Northline grew quickly and solidly. We hired good people, kept a decent work culture, and the revenue was steady enough that for the first time in my life, I no longer looked at my bank balance like I was holding my breath. I still did not call home. I did not send holiday texts. I did not check in. I did not explain myself. The silence between me and my family lasted so long that it no longer felt like distance. It became a boundary. Then Grandma Evelyn died. I went back for the funeral, sat in the back row, listened to the beautiful eulogies people always give for the dead, and thought about her voice in those Sunday afternoon phone calls, thought about the way her hand used to hold mine tightly, as if she were trying to pass into it the strength she knew I would need. 3 days after the funeral, I got a call from Eleanor Smith, her attorney. Her voice was clear and professional, but softened just enough when she said my name. "Natalie, Evelyn left a separate trust for you. She put it in place years ago." I sat there in silence as Eleanor read my grandmother's handwritten letter. She wrote that she knew I had been treated unfairly. She knew my father had broken my future and called it responsibility. She did not ask me to forgive anyone. She only wanted me to have enough leverage that I would never have to bow my head to the people who had once made me question my own worth. Before hanging up, Eleanor was quiet for a few seconds, then added, as if she knew the next sentence would stay with me for a very long time, "There is one more sealed envelope. Evelyn instructed me to open it only if your father ever publicly humiliated you again in front of other people." I kept that envelope in my desk drawer for months, until the night of the gala. I had kept it there so long that I had almost forgotten the feel of thick paper under my fingertips. But that night, sitting alone in my car under the pale yellow lights of the hotel parking lot, I knew I could not leave it untouched in that drawer for one more day. Before that, when I agreed to attend the gala, I kept telling myself I was only going to show up for one evening and leave the way adults do, calm, polite, not letting the past decide the attitude of the present. Part of me truly believed I could look at them clearly one last time, look at that family, the way you look at an old house you know you will never return to. Then gently close that door inside myself with my own hand. But the moment I walked into the ballroom, I understood that I was still the extra in the story they told about themselves. My name was placed at the table farthest away, near the service door, far enough that no one had to remember I carried the Brooks name too. No one in the family came over to introduce me to the guests. No one said, "This is Natalie." I was simply there like a minor formatting error in a night that had been arranged too perfectly. Then the conversations started coming, smooth as silk and sharp as paper cuts. An old friend of my father's tilted his head and asked whether I was still in Boston these days, in a tone that sounded like he was asking someone who had never really found her way back. A woman I only vaguely remembered from a few Christmas parties years ago smiled kindly and said, "Your father always worries about you. He says you've been a little sensitive lately." Someone else asked whether I had met anyone serious yet, then answered her own question with a pitying smile, saying that women my age usually start thinking differently about settling down. I stood there with a champagne glass in my hand and listened as each sentence landed like a tiny needle. None of them were crude enough to be called cruel, but put together, they formed a complete portrait my father must have painted for the whole room long before I arrived. Natalie is a failure. Natalie is lost. Natalie is fragile. Natalie is the kind of name people mention in a lowered voice, just enough for others to pity her. Just enough that no one expects too much from her. Marcus found me in the hallway before the speeches started. He leaned against the wall, one hand in his pocket, looking comfortable, as if the whole evening had been staged to serve his sense of superiority. "You actually came," he said, his eyes sweeping over me from head to toe. "I figured you'd avoid a room full of successful people." "I think I can handle it," I said. Marcus laughed, the kind of laugh that did not need to be loud to be insulting. "Some people are born to run empires, Natalie, and some are only born to prove that even under the same roof, you can still end up with dead weight." I looked at him for one more second, then walked past him. At that point, I had almost decided to leave. I really thought I could walk out, drive straight back to Boston, and leave them there with their lights and their applause. But then my father stepped onto the stage, took the microphone, and chose me as the final joke in the most glorious farewell performance of his life. The rest happened quickly, and yet seemed to stretch on forever. The laughter, the looks, the silence after what I said, my footsteps across the wooden floor, the door closing behind me. By the time I got into the car, locked the doors, and let my forehead rest against the steering wheel for a few seconds, I realized my hands were so cold they were almost numb. I opened my bag, took out my grandmother's envelope, and handled it carefully, as if one harder movement might shatter whatever was left of me. Inside was a short letter, a copy of the education trust my mother had set up for me before she died, and the document confirming who had withdrawn most of that money. Richard Brooks. I read that name over and over until my vision blurred, not because I did not understand it, but because at last, every empty space in my past suddenly closed into a shape so brutally clear. My father had not been helpless. It was not that he had no choice. He had taken the very future my mother left for me and transferred it to Marcus Mercer. And then years later he could still stand in front of a crowd and call me the child who was not worth investing in. I sat in the car for a long time, my hands shaking, feeling as though the pain had moved past tears into something sharper and harder to name. When I picked up my phone, my voice sounded strange, like it belonged to someone else. Eleanor answered on the second ring. "Natalie?" I stared straight through the windshield, where the hotel lights still looked warm and golden, as if nothing inside had just been destroyed. "Send everything," I said. "Tonight." Eleanor did not ask whether I was sure. She was only quiet for one very short beat, then said in that same steady voice, "I'll have everything ready within an hour." By the time I drove back to Boston, the lights in the 12th floor conference room at Northline were still on. Daniel was already there. His tie loosened, his laptop open, a neat stack of documents beside him, as if he had guessed that tonight was not going to end with sleep. I set my grandmother's envelope down on the table. Daniel looked at my face once, then did not ask a single unnecessary question. That was one of the things I had always valued about him. Some people, when they see you are hurt, try to pull you into an emotional conversation just so they can feel kind. Daniel was different. He respected the facts first, then made room for the feelings after. "What are we doing?" he asked. I sat down and slipped off the high heels that had been making my feet ache for hours. "3 things," I said. "No contract renewal, a private letter to Richard Brooks, and a confidential email to the board so they can't pretend they didn't know what was coming." Daniel nodded without looking surprised. "Official reason? Strategic repositioning." "The real reason?" I looked out at the night beyond the glass, where the city lights stretched cold and beautiful like a painting with no room for weakness. "I'm not taking revenge," I said slowly. "I'm just stopping myself from keeping them on their feet." No one in the room objected to that. Eleanor arrived almost 40 minutes later, carrying the first draft of the legal notice. Everything was written cleanly and precisely without a single unnecessary word. No accusations, no emotion, nothing that gave anyone a chance to call me unprofessional or out of control. We reviewed every clause, every timeline, every consequence we could reasonably predict. I kept everything factual, lawful, and impossible to dismiss as an emotional outburst. I simply removed my hand from under something other people had grown used to standing on without ever looking down to see who the ground beneath them belonged to. The private letter to my father was the only part I wrote myself. I wrote more slowly than I expected. Not because I lacked the words, but because I wanted every sentence to stand on the truth alone. I wrote that he had called me worthless, and yet for years the value he relied on had been mine. I wrote that he had taken away my path to an education, and I had built that path back with my own hands. I wrote that I was not ending this business relationship to destroy him, but to end a dependence built on contempt and lies. At the end, I signed my name very clearly. Natalie Brooks. By the time the last email was scheduled to go out, it was nearly 3 in the morning. I stood alone in my office, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, looking down at the city below in the pale light of dawn, rising very slowly. What I felt did not feel like victory. It felt like setting down something heavy you had carried for too long, then suddenly realizing your arms hurt so badly you could barely lift them. The next morning, my phone started vibrating before 7. Richard Brooks. I let it ring until the screen went dark. 2 minutes later, it was him again. Then Marcus. Then Linda. By the time I stepped into the elevator on my way up to the office, the messages were already piling up. From my father, call me now. From Marcus. What the hell did you do? From Linda, exactly as I had expected, came the same soft, fake tone she always used whenever she wanted to push someone back into the position that benefited her most. We can talk this through like family. Family. I stood in the elevator, watching that word light up on the screen and then fade, and felt something almost unfamiliar move through me. It did not hurt the way it used to. What moved through me was not pain so much as distance. At the office, Daniel was already waiting with the first update. The board of Brooks Global Freight had received the confidential email. Their CFO had already started calling my legal department, sounding both panicked and determined to stay calm. They wanted to confirm whether this was the final decision. They wanted to know whether there was still room to negotiate. They wanted to know who was really behind Northline's strategy group. From the way Daniel lifted an eyebrow as he reread a few lines from the call notes, I knew the people on the other side were beginning to put the first pieces together. By noon, Linda had stopped sending sweet, polished messages. Marcus had switched to half-formed threats. My father went completely silent for nearly an hour, and that kind of silence had always been more unsettling than an outburst of anger. Then, right at the beginning of the afternoon, Eleanor called me. She did not waste time. He knows now, she said. Richard Brooks has just confirmed the identity of Northline's ultimate owner. I stood by the office window, my hand tightening slightly against the cool glass. That's all? I asked. No, Eleanor said, her voice as calm as ever. He was also just informed, very clearly, that the person he called useless was the same person whose company had been quietly stabilizing some of the most critical parts of his business. They arrived in the early afternoon, almost 40 minutes earlier than I expected. The receptionist called upstairs to say 3 people were there to see me, her voice still professionally even, but just enough for me to hear that she was trying not to sound curious. I stood in front of my office window for a few seconds, looking at my own faint reflection in the glass, then told her to send them into conference room B. I chose that room because it had glass walls on 2 sides. My employees could see inside, see who came in, see who walked out, see the posture of every person in the room, but no one could hear a single word. I did not do it to humiliate them. I did it because I had spent too many years in a family that could twist any story until the person who got hurt was still the one treated like the problem. This time, I wanted witnesses, even if they were only silent ones. When I walked in, my father was standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out over Boston Harbor, as though he still believed he could walk into any place and turn it into his own territory. He turned around first. His eyes rested on me for 1 second longer than usual, as though he still had not fully adjusted to the fact that this was my office, my company, my world. Natalie, I pulled out a chair and sat down at the head of the table. Everyone, have a seat. Marcus did not sit. What the hell is this? He shouted, his voice so tight it was almost cracking. What do you think you're doing? I think you should sit down if you want this conversation to last longer than 3 minutes, I said. Maybe it was my tone that made him pause. Not because it was loud, but because it was calm. Marcus looked at my father, as if waiting for the familiar signal that the older person in the room would immediately take back control, but my father only said shortly, "Sit down." When all three of them had finally settled into their seats, my father placed both hands on the edge of the table and leaned forward. "Natalie, this has gone too far. If you're angry about that night, we can deal with this like family. There's no need to turn it into some corporate spectacle." I placed one file in front of him, then one in front of Linda, and one in front of Marcus. "I'm not turning it into anything. I'm just done pretending that what happened between us was ever separate from business, money, and power." My father did not open the file right away. "You're reacting emotionally." "No," I said. "I'm reacting after 13 years of thinking very clearly." Linda was the first to open her file. She flipped through the business registration papers, the ownership records, the operating reports, then stopped at the page with my name listed as the founder and ultimate owner of Northline. I saw the color drain from her face so fast that she had to place her hand on the edge of the paper to steady herself. "That's impossible," she said very softly. "You couldn't possibly." "Why?" I asked. "Because I don't have a degree? Because I didn't marry a rich husband? Or because in your mind, I only belong standing at the edge of a family photo to fill the frame?" Linda looked up, her lips pressed together. She did not answer. Only then did my father open the file. I watched his eyes move across the numbers, the operational dependency charts, the reports showing just how deeply Brooks Global Freight had relied on Northline's system over the past 3 years. There was a very slight change in his jaw. Just a little. But for someone who had watched that face through her entire childhood, I recognized it immediately. That was the moment he started to understand that this was more serious than he had thought. Marcus slammed his hand on the table. "You're destroying this family over one comment at a party just to get revenge?" I turned to him. "No. I'm protecting something that was never yours." He let out a harsh laugh. "Protecting it? You cut the contract, put the company at risk, put employees in danger, and you call that protecting something?" I held his gaze. "I'm not the one who put your company in a position of dependency. I didn't force you to sign, renew, and lean on my system until you couldn't stand without it. I'm just not keeping you from falling anymore." The room went quiet for a beat. Beyond the glass wall, I saw a few employees walking past, their eyes flicking over briefly but not lingering. They were polite enough to pretend they were not looking, but their presence in sight was enough to keep anyone in that room from raising their voice the way my family always used to. I opened my briefcase and took out the final set of papers, placing them on the table very slowly. "But the contract isn't the only reason I asked all of you to come up here." My father looked at the papers, then at me. Something like a premonition passed through his eyes. "What is that?" "My education fund Mom left for me," I said, "and the documents confirming who withdrew most of that money." No one moved. Even Marcus was silent for the first time since he had walked into the room. My father did not reach for the papers right away. Maybe he knew. Maybe he had forgotten that he ever knew. Or maybe there are secrets people bury so deeply that when they are dragged back into the light, even they need a few seconds to recognize them as their own. Linda was the one who touched the papers first. She turned the first page, then the second, then stopped where Richard Brooks's signature appeared. Her hand tightened so hard that the joints of her fingers turned white. Marcus leaned over his mother's shoulder, read a few lines, then jerked his head up. "What the hell is this?" I did not look at him. I looked at my father. "It's what should have been used for my education, what Mom left for me before she died. What you took." That last sentence fell very softly, but the weight of it seemed to suck all the air out of the room. My father finally picked up the papers. He did not turn many pages. Just a few. Then his hand stopped. For the first time in my life, he did not look like a powerful man being challenged. He looked like a man being made to stand in front of himself. In front of a version of himself he had spent many years trying to avoid. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. I thought I was making the practical choice. Something in my chest tightened, not because I felt sorry for him, but because at last he had spoken the truest thing about himself in plain language. No love, no morality, no fairness. Just what he liked to call practicality. You didn't make a practical choice, I said. You made a cowardly one, and taught everyone else to call it leadership. My father closed his eyes for one very brief moment. Linda turned her face away. Marcus looked from one person to another, as if, for the first time in his life, he did not know who he was supposed to be angry at first. I stood up before anyone else. This meeting is over. Marcus shot to his feet too. You can't just— I can, I cut in, and I just did. Linda picked up her purse and stood more slowly, as if she still could not quite process this room, this position, this reality. My father was the last one to stand. He looked at me for a long time, long enough that I wondered whether he was trying to find in my face the daughter he had once believed he could remove from the equation without consequence. When he reached the door, he stopped. What do you want from me? I looked at him, so calm that even I found it strange. No more rising anger. No more need to hurt him more, just to balance out the years he had hurt me. Nothing, I said. That's the part you don't know how to survive. The conference room door closed behind them very softly, almost without making a sound. Once the confrontation was over, the real aftermath began, and it was quieter than I had expected. But for the rest of that day, I still felt as though that sound stayed inside my chest, like something had truly ended, instead of just turning into another threat or another temporary distance. I went back to my desk, opened my laptop, answered a few emails, signed 2 internal documents, and joined a short meeting with the operations team downstairs. On the surface, everything kept moving as usual. But I knew that back in Connecticut, an important gear had started slipping out of place. In the weeks that followed, the news did not reach me through the press first. It came through unusual silences between the lines of reporting. Daniel walked into my office one Monday morning, set a file on my desk, then pulled out a chair and sat across from me. They're losing steam faster than expected, he said. Performance on 3 key routes is dropping noticeably. 2 major clients are asking for contract reviews, and the board isn't as happy with Marcus as they used to be. I looked at the numbers, the downward trending charts, the brief notes that were still enough to make the scale of the problem clear. None of it was surprising. This was the natural result of a company that had grown too used to relying on a system it did not build, then assumed it had the right to own both the results and the person behind them. Richard was forced to return to the company at the exact moment when he was supposed to be enjoying the first few months of his so-called honorable retirement. But what pushed everything off course the fastest was not just operations. It was reputation. Connecticut has the kind of society where people still smile at each other over dinner and then retell each other's lives behind closed doors. In the business circles there, information rarely travels in a straight line like a news report. It spreads like a crack across glass, at first so small only a few people notice it, then before long everyone knows something has broken. The story of the gala night and Northline began to be repeated with more and more complete details. The man who had stood in front of a crowd and mocked his own daughter for entertainment had, it turned out, been relying heavily on her company throughout the final years of his career. The people who had laughed in that ballroom that night now started lowering their voices when they mentioned my father's name. Not out of kindness. Only because in communities like that, people can forgive arrogance longer than they can forgive exposed stupidity. I started getting calls from relatives who for years could barely remember my birthday. Some began with an apology so awkward I did not know whether to feel sorry for them or laugh. Some said they had no idea things were that serious, as if their lack of attention were its own kind of innocence. Some took the long way around just to find out whether I really was the owner of Northline. I did not hang up on them, but I did not open my heart either. Some doors, once they close, leave the sound of their hinges with you for a very long time, and I no longer wanted to live in a house where people only knocked when they started feeling cold. Then, one rainy evening, when I had just gotten back to my apartment and had not even taken off my shoes yet, my phone lit up with a name I had to stare at for a few seconds before I recognized it. Robert Brooks. My father's younger brother. A man who had drifted through my childhood here and there, like a gentler shadow than the rest of the family. Then almost disappeared after my mother's funeral. I answered. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then his voice came through, older than I remembered. Rougher, but still carrying that awkward sincerity that made you believe he was not calling just to satisfy his curiosity. Natalie, he said, I don't know if I have the right to call you, but there's something you need to know. I sat down on the edge of the chair without turning on the living room light. The glow from the window was only enough to leave the outlines of things faintly visible. I'm listening. Robert let out a very slow breath. Before your mother died, she didn't just set up an education fund for you. She also left a letter for Richard. He paused, as if even having to continue made him feel ashamed on behalf of his brother. In that letter, she asked him for one thing: that he never let you grow up feeling like you were a burden. That no matter what happened, your future was never to become the thing that could be easily sacrificed. I said nothing. I listened to the rain tapping steadily against the window, soft but persistent, like someone trying to call out from very far away. Richard read that letter, Robert went on. He knew what your mother wanted. He knew exactly, and then he still did the opposite. Some truths do not hit you like a blow. They just open up a freezing space inside your chest, where before there had still been something like the ability to comfort yourself with the thought that maybe it had only been favoritism, weakness, a chain of bad decisions made under pressure. But what Robert had just said cut off even that last possibility. My father had not simply ignored my mother's final wish because he was helpless or blind. He knew. He had read the final plea of the woman who had once loved him. And he still chose to turn me into the very thing she had begged him not to make me become. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, my voice so low it almost blended into the sound of the rain. On the other end of the line, Robert was quiet for a long time. Because I was a coward, he said plainly. And after seeing everything over the past few weeks, I couldn't live with it anymore. I closed my eyes, not to hold back tears. They did not come. There was only a very clear feeling settling quietly inside me, like mud sinking after the rain, revealing the bottom of the water I had spent years avoiding. Robert spoke again, slowly, like he wanted to make sure I heard every word. He didn't just fail your mother, Natalie. He read her last wish and chose against it. I sat there in the dark for a long time after the call ended. And that was the moment I understood that the most painful part was not what my family had taken from me, but the fact that none of it had been a misunderstanding. Not a regrettable mess. Not random scars left by life. This had been a chain of deliberate betrayals, repeated over many years with the coldness of people who always knew exactly what they were doing. After my call with Uncle Robert, I could not fall asleep right away. I sat by the window for a long time, watching the raindrops slide down the black glass, and realized that the sharp feeling that had kept me standing through the past few weeks was no longer there in the same way. It had not disappeared completely. It had simply changed shape, becoming a quiet kind of lightness, thin and still. Like when someone finally sets down a suitcase they have carried for so long, they forgot its real weight. I had thought that if the truth ever came out, if my father ever had to face everything he had done, I would feel more satisfaction than this. But what remained in me did not feel like triumph. It was a clean kind of sadness. The sadness of someone finally accepting that what she lost had never been a perfect family. What I had lost was the illusion that someday, if I were good enough, patient enough, worthy enough of love, I would finally be chosen. A few weeks later, I started therapy. My therapist's office was on a quiet street in Back Bay, on the third floor of an old brownstone building, where the hallway always smelled faintly of tea and paper. In the first session, I sat in a cream-upholstered chair, both hands on my knees, and did not know where to begin. She did not push me. She only asked very gently, "What kind of person did you get used to becoming in order to be allowed to stay inside other people's love?" That question stayed with me for days. I began learning how to tell the difference between being loved and having to behave well enough to be accepted. Those two things had been tangled together inside me for so long that I had thought they were the same. I used to think silence was maturity. Endurance was kindness. Making myself smaller was how you kept the peace. But it turned out that some kinds of silence are just the fear of being abandoned dressed up in good manners. There are people who make you spend your whole life trying to prove that you are not a burden, when the one who should be ashamed was never you. Meanwhile, Northline kept moving forward, with the steady rhythm of something built on a real foundation. We replaced the old contract with new clients, slightly smaller, more diverse, safer. Daniel said in one meeting, half joking and half serious, "At least from now on, we don't have to worry about some family throwing off the balance sheet." I smiled. For the first time in a very long while, work was no longer the place where I poured all my pain just to get back a sense of control. It simply became work again. The thing I was good at. The thing I had built with my own hands. I also started seeing Uncle Robert more often. We had dinner once a month at a small restaurant near the Charles River, where the lighting was always warm enough to let people tell old stories without feeling like they were hurting themselves all over again. He told me about my mother. Not the version of her that had been flattened into a few polished lines in family stories, but the real woman. Stubborn, intelligent, capable of arguing something all the way through if she believed she was right, fond of classical music on Sunday mornings, and always keeping a book in her purse. "You're like her in the way you don't bend easily," he said one night like that. I looked down at the glass of water in front of me, my throat tightening. Some words come too late, but they can still heal part of you. I visit Grandma Evelyn's grave regularly. At first, I only brought flowers, stood there a few minutes, and left. But one early spring morning, when the wind was still cold and the ground still smelled like the night's rain, I sat down in front of the stone engraved with her name, placed a bouquet of white tulips beside it, and for the first time, I let myself cry like a child. Not the restrained, graceful, silent kind of crying I had gotten far too used to, but the kind of tears that come from somewhere very deep and very real. As if my body had finally believed I had survived long enough that I no longer had to hold myself together every second. A few months later, my father sent me a handwritten letter. Not through a lawyer, not through an assistant. The envelope was cream-colored, and the handwriting was still as neat as I remembered from old Christmas cards. I left it on the table for almost 2 days before opening it. There was no plea for the contract in the letter, no sentence demanding his rights as a father back. Most of it was just short lines, clumsier than I had ever imagined he was capable of writing, but there was one sentence that left me sitting still for a very long time. "I built a company and lost a daughter trying to prove I knew how to lead. I did not go back. And I did not rush to forgive him just to turn myself into the noble one in my own story." Some wounds do not need to be fed with hatred, but they also cannot be erased just because the person who caused them finally sees them. I simply stopped living on anger. I used to think freedom would be loud. I used to imagine it would feel like victory, like revenge, like the moment you watch the person who hurt you finally collapse. But freedom turned out to be much quieter than that. It was the moment I understood that I no longer needed them to see my value in order to believe I had value. I did not destroy my family. I simply stopped doing the work for them they had never even known I was doing. And sometimes, that truth alone is painful enough for a person to carry for the rest of their life. Maybe the hardest part is not leaving. Maybe it is accepting that there are places you loved with your whole heart that were never truly yours to belong to. If my story touched you in some way, please subscribe to the channel and stay with me for the stories ahead. And I'd truly love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? Or have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved just to protect your own peace? Sometimes just knowing you were never alone can be a kind of healing all by itself.